audience come from Latin America, so we'll do a little Spanish, a little English. I'll just introduce the subject. Our panel today is called Rebuilding Trust in Latin America, and it really has a double meaning. Internally, it means rebuilding confidence in democracy through legitimacy, through security and stability, but also, I think, through the state's capacity to bring back trust in its performance, in its results. Externally, I think it has to do with credibility. Credibility that allows us to build strategic partnerships, long-term sustainable investment in the region, and a constructive role in a very turbulent geopolitical moment. So if you don't mind, we were saying backstage, it's impossible to ignore the moment. As a journalist, I promise I won't stay in the moment. There's so much to talk about, but we do have to address what's happening in Venezuela, in the region. Presidente Noboa, if you don't mind, we could start there. There seems to be a false, I don't want to call it a debate, but a false choice between stability and security and giving up principles and autonomy in order to secure that. How do you see that equation and the role the U.S. has now promised to play in the hemisphere, in what it calls its hemisphere?
Well, thank you. It's an interesting subject, definitely. But when we were talking about autonomy, it's autonomy of the people. In the case of Venezuela, the people of Venezuela chose a president, and the results were not respected by a regime, by a dictatorship. So the whole concept of autonomy is broken there, because it's not autonomy. They're just the people have been held hostage by a regime that decided that they were not going to leave. So personally, I think we can always dream for a better way to do things, but the result is that the people of Venezuela now see hope, now see a light at the end of the tunnel. There's 500,000 Venezuelans in Ecuador, a lot of them that left with nothing, and they had to, relearn life. And I see most of them, if not all of them, happy with this result. So that goes back to the concept of autonomy. They want a better future. The people of Venezuela want a free country, a democracy. And if this is the way that they can obtain it, then I'll be rooting for it.
President Mulino, Panama sits at the crossroads diplomatically, geographically, economically of everything that happens in our hemisphere, in our region. How do you see the U.S. intervention in Venezuela and what has happened since the detention and removal of Nicolás Maduro in that country?
Well, it's a very complex question. As most of you may know, my country suffered an invasion because of another dictator, Manuel Noriega, in '89. Everything was ready to finalize a big and deep political crisis into such a movement. Those days, Panama used to have internally military troops of the United States. We were in the last phase of the implementation of the Panama Canal Treaty. They left on the 31st of December of '99, 10 years after that. But that situation, as in Venezuela, was provoked by one single person and his entourage. They, as the president said, they forgot about democracy, human rights, all kinds of possibilities to live under democratic rules in general. But Panama has a long-standing relationship with Venezuela. We are not neighbors, as my friend, the president of Ecuador, but we suffer the consequences through the immigration crisis that passed through Panama. And roughly speaking, in the last year of my government, when I assumed the government, I went to the area in the Colombian-Panama border.
The Darien Gap?
The Darien Gap, yes, known as Darien Gap. There were 5 entrances, illegal entrances, of course. We shot 4 and left 1. And I said, in 1 year I finished this, and I did it in 10 months. With a lot of courage and determination, no waiver. Today we have 0 immigrants. But Venezuela were the 94% of those immigrants, good and bad, no? Because, as I said in that moment, that particular place within our territory, but bordered with Colombia, was as a concentration camp of the 21st century. That dramatic was it, very dramatic. And you find them, most of them, the majority, 93, 94% were Venezuela. The other were Colombian, Colombia, Venezuela, Chinese.
Caribbean countries also.
No.
Haiti,
no.
Cuba.
Well, Haiti, yes. Haiti, yes. The entrance, as far as I know, through Ecuador, but I might be wrong.
And immigration will be a key topic of our discussion today.
Oh, yes, no, immigration, it's impossible to run a country in terms of stability if you have a migratory crisis. We have in Panama, I should say, around 100,000 Venezuelans investing, working, that simply came to Panama back in 2006, 2007, imagining what was coming on.
Yeah.
And they work perfectly, and they are completely integrated to the Panamanian society. But the other ones, poor people, especially poor people with kids, experience maybe the most dramatic nightmare they had in mind. And they went up. The final destination was US, of course. I don't know how many of them crossed the line or how many of them were returned. The thing is that we have now the same situation on the opposite direction, but with very much less Venezuelan. Still, the 90% of the people coming north-south are Venezuelan, but we are dealing with 200-something per month. And we immediately take them, move to the Atlantic side of Panama in the border of Colombia, and move them to Colombia by boat or by plane through a process that we have of immigration return for foreigners.
And we will address this immigration crisis and the effect it's had in the region and, of course, in the relationship with the United States more in depth. But I want to ask Neri Woods about how Latin Americans should interpret this moment, especially in an increasingly contested global order.
Yeah, so, well, as Dean of a School of Government, I see leaders from 65 or so different countries in the school each year. And sometimes they debate who's got the worst leader. And Zimbabwe will say, well, ours, and Venezuela will say, well, ours, etc., right? And it poses the question, if another country has a bad leader, why not remove them? Well, who to remove them? And for 100 years, there's been norms about not removing other countries' leaders. We don't have time to go into those norms, but I just do want to pick up on something the President just said, which is the record of one country removing another country's leader simply because they can is not great. In Panama, in Haiti, in Iraq, let's not forget the US said we're coming to liberate you, in Libya, that it's not enough simply to make one leader disappear. The world keeps imagining that nothing could be worse than the leader that they've got, and then finding to their horror that things can actually get worse. Which is why a principle of not doing this has long been with us, because it's not about getting rid of the one person. It's about what do you do with the institutions? What do you do with the people? What do you do with their aspirations afterwards? Do you go as an occupying force and spend 10 years trying to rebuild? Do you bring the whole of the international community together to make them a sort of annexed territory of a global community? It's really difficult. And there are other options to going in and capturing a leader and removing them. There are other ways that an international community can support people to end up with a government that is their choice. And so I think when it comes to Venezuela and Latin America, we need to think, well, what happened to those other means of supporting Venezuelans to ensure that the person they elected to be president would be elected? And what's the difference between saying this is a judicial exfiltration, we're just taking this person to put them on trial in the United States, and saying we are now governing Venezuela. We are now in charge of Venezuela. You know, big responsibility. We'll see how that goes.
And Venezuelan resources as well. I see a theme emerging in our discussion, Ian, and it's not exclusive to the rooms of the World Economic Forum. I think it's part of what we've seen in the last few weeks in this conversation about the region. A necessary response to a regional disorder, this intervention, or something that undermines sovereignty, multilateralism, and long-term trust, which is the essential concept of our conversation. How do you see it?
Well, we are in the business of trying to improve the lives of people in the region. That's our region. We do it in moments where we believe that the market cannot do it by itself, so that we have some additionality. And in the moments of change, moments where we see that there are conditions for a sustainable recovery, we do intervene, use the resources to do so. And yes, that's part of regaining trust, because I think multilateral institutions have the ability to bring trust to types of economic intervention. But you need the conditions to do so. And some of them are more practical conditions. So for example, in the case of Venezuela, you need to have legitimate by our boards to engage. We need to have approval. We have 48 members of our board, so we need approval of the members. We need to be in relationship, economic relationship, which we don't have at this point with Venezuela for other reasons. But there are other conditions which are you need to intervene when you believe that there is a possibility of sustainable recovery, when the investment can look at the long term and believe it's a moment to enter and to have investments for the future. And that's what we're looking. In the meantime, we are an institution, the IDB. We have been following Venezuela for decades, and we continue to do so, even these years. So, for example, the data most used are the data that we provide by our proprietary service, social and macroeconomic, and we have been following Venezuela in the best way we can, and we're preparing ourselves for when and if the conditions arise.
Do you know something? Let me ask just one thing.
Absolutely.
We have regional institutions in Latin America, OAS mainly.
Yes.
Some others in the United Nations. But the problem is that when you go to exercise your right as a country to the OAS, for example, they are very weak, to say the least. They are very weak, and they do nothing. They do nothing. We suffered that in Panama. We exercised all the possibilities to get out of the crisis. Venezuela, I don't know how much they did, but the problem is when you discuss in the OAS and try to adopt a resolution condemning, not saying more than condemning, immediately 1, 2, 3 countries exercise the lack of consensus, which is the opposite side of a veto, right? No? I am not in the consensus. I am vetoing the resolution. So the inefficiency of our organizations in the region, that doesn't resolve a crisis.
I think it's a crisis that extends beyond the region to global multilateral institutions. I was saying at the beginning that there's two components to democracy, right? The legitimacy, elections, and all the values and principles of a liberal democracy, but then there's performance and results. And at the heart of that, President Noboa, is security. You've had that experience in Ecuador. How's that trade-off between acting fast, acting decisively, and making sure that you're preserving the democratic norms?
Well, it's always difficult when you're at war, and we're at war. We're at war against narco-terrorism. If you add up the amount of fighters, you'd say from the three largest, they're not gangs anymore, they are transnational narco-terrorist groups. We are today above 60,000 armed men and women. And it's very difficult to fight this in a traditional way, almost impossible. Also because throughout time, these criminal organizations have adapted to our system. In the case of Ecuador, we have a constitution that gives a lot of guarantees to citizens. So they adapt. They know exactly what to do. They know exactly how to get caught. They know how to present an habeas corpus. They know how to play the game. So by using all the democratic, let's say, ways, rules, they know how to play them better. That's the reality. We're fighting a war that is not only on the street. It's a war that is in courts, is a war that is in the media, is a war that is in social media also. It's a complete war against evil and narco-terrorism. That's why the only indicator that we see now, and that I tell my team that we should see, is the poverty index. Not GDP growth, not anything else. So we see the poverty index. Why? Because in a ways we're taking people out of poverty, out of the hands of these narco-terrorist groups, and we're giving them a chance to live a regular life. Ecuador right now, poverty index is at 21.4. It's the lowest poverty index rate in the history of the country. And for me, it's the only number that matters. But there's a fine line between protecting people and protecting the rights of people. Protecting the rights of the majority of people or protecting the rights of the minority that wants to destabilize. It's a question that we ask ourselves every single day, that we have to fight every day to keep that balance. If we break that balance, then we would not be any better than Maduro.
And Nair Woods, this situation where emergency measures seem more permanent, not just in Ecuador, but in other parts of the hemisphere, this erosion of trust in the capacity of the state to intervene in a way that really moves the needle and makes a difference in people's lives. Do you think that's the primary failure of democracy in Latin America?
Yeah, I think we're living in a moment where leaders across the world are making choices between policies of coercion and policies of co-option and accommodation. And coercion is tempting. It's tempting in the face of some of the atrocities that narco-terrorists deploy. It's tempting when you think you're up against evil forces. But the problem for any society is that if you make enemies of the people within your society, where does that take you? What is the future? Do you simply try to extinguish a whole group of people? Or are you actually trying to build a society that in the end can live together? And we've seen this all over. You know, under colonial rule, you saw Britain trying to do it by coercion in Kenya, in India, etc. You saw it in Northern Ireland for years, a terrible civil war, because each side felt that they were fighting evil on the other. And we've seen it in Colombia, in Latin America. We've seen 3 different approaches to internal, some would say, terrorism, to internal groups that pose a security threat and risk both to the state and to other citizens. But my observation, looking right across the world, is that each of the situations that's been resolved has ended up having to be resolved through dialogue. Dialogue doesn't mean embracing narco-terrorists, but it does mean thinking about how you deal with adversaries without making them into perpetual enemies. It does mean look at the experience of other countries in finding a way to build to a future together. Because in the end, a society that is in a perpetual civil war is never going to be secure for anybody, not for its citizens, not for its government, not for its international investors. And so, in Northern Ireland, it endured decades before people came together and had the courage to create a process for actually talking through what it would take to live side by side and not live in fear of terror every day.
Let me change the tone a little bit before we go to our audience for questions, because Latin America seems to be back at the center of global geopolitics, and it's not because of its internal challenges, which we've already covered some of them, but because the world increasingly needs or depends on the region for its resources, migration control, and policy alignment. So, Ian, in terms of the opportunity there, a world that is more dependent of Latin American resources, of Latin American stability, political alignment. What does that mean for the region, for the region's future?
Well, it is definitely we are seeing more attention to the hemisphere, to the region, and this is a double sword because at the same time there is a lot of challenges and geopolitical issues that come to the forum, but there's also opportunities. And our challenge together is to use these challenges and enhance the opportunities. You mentioned critical minerals. Definitely, if the world is looking for safe supply chains, to diversify them, and the region is responsible for at least 1/3 of the minerals of the world, this is the place where we can embrace and be part of the global economy in a constructive way. And the way to do it is, of course, bringing value, bringing investment, bringing processing, try to bring more job creation with this opportunity. There are other opportunities, energy supply, also very important coming from the region. Security, we are part of which this discussion of security is very important. This is about organized crime. It is not about just one country. It's not about only Ecuador, Panama. It is across the region. One thing that surprised me the most when I got to the job was that the development bank will do security. We cannot hire police or military, that we created the Alliance for Security, because every other president in the region, independent of the political side, will tell us, for development, we need to deal with security. So the Alliance is against the organized crime, is about organizing ourselves, is about exchanging information. For example, one result of the Alliance is exchanging criminal records that we didn't have. When one criminal crossed the border, we didn't exchange it. So now we're doing it. Or we're using technology to use Brazilian, for example, looking at illegal mining in the Amazon and do it in the rest. Things like that, we need to start using intelligence. Why is it a regional opportunity? Because part of the organized crime and the narco traffic is part of the region, and it's an opportunity for us to embrace it and to try to do it in a constructive way through dealing with social, as the President Boa mentioned, dealing with the institution, giving them the support where the state can be present, and finally, dealing with the legal transfer of money that we can try to work on.
Ian was mentioning, President Molino, the political spectrum, the ideological spectrum in Latin America, how it has shifted from a more leftist governments in Latin America to a mix of conservative and leftist governments. How do you see that in terms of the global cooperation that it's needed in the hemisphere, given everything that we're seeing in the world right now?